Spread love everywhere you go. First of all, in your own house. Give love to your children, to your wife or husband, to a next door neighbor, to a friend, to strangers. Let no one ever come to you without leaving better and happier. Ladies and gentlemen, as we continue to write the chapter of our generation in Uganda and Africa in general, it is imperative that we pause between the pages and reflect on the journey ahead. We have made great strides as a society, with significant growth in the economic, political, and social fabric of our nations. Like many of our forefathers, who were the first to be infiltrated by explorers and missionaries, we have had important choices to make. Choices that have often conflicted with our culture. Choices that have challenged our traditional norms. Choices that have challenged our customs and values. And choices that have often changed our way of life. As the world shrinks into a global village, the front line of the battle against universal human rights has moved into our backyard. Many leaders, and some in the public on our continent and in our nation, mostly through their actions, are not eager to embrace the universal concept of human rights. They hold the belief that human rights should be culturally specific, arguing that there is no objective standard to judge every society in a different culture, religious or ethnic setting. This school of thought condemns universal human rights as Western imperialism. A similar rebuke was witnessed during the 1993 United Nations Conference on Human Rights in Vienna, where China, Iran, and Syria challenged the universality of human rights. This is a critical debate in our society, and it is a debate we should have and continue having. The question I ask today: should universal human rights take precedence over customary law? And secondly, can universal human rights exist in a culturally diverse world? The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted by the United Nations General Assembly in 1948. It is a template from which member nations are expected to create an environment that caters for the civil, economic, and social rights of their citizens. Africa followed the footsteps of Europe and North America and adopted the Banjul Charter on Human and People's Rights in 1981 that went into effect in 1986. This charter, unlike the Universal Declaration, approaches human rights with a holistic perspective, recognizing the existence and importance of culture and group rights. In spite of these legal frameworks and numerous other treaties, the human rights record on the continent is abysmal. Our leadership establishment continues to take these basic principles for granted. Some leaders have gone as far as irresponsibly putting forward legislation and defending it using culture and religious dogma. The consequence of these actions or inactions has been isolationism and intolerance, creating a society in which it is not safe to be a minority, a society in which it is not safe to openly stand behind unpopular positions without fear or intimidation. To the present day, our nations continue to set foot on an inhuman road of injustice. We continue to set foot on an inhuman road of injustice. On July 3rd of each year, thousands of pilgrims flock to Namugongo Martyrs Shrine in Uganda. This is an age-long ritual to commemorate the 45 Anglican and Roman Catholic martyrs who were executed because of their faith by Kabaka Mwanga of Buganda between 1885 and 1887. Some were beheaded, and others were burnt alive. Mwanga massacred these converts because he believed that they had become loyal to the new religions and abandoned traditional and cultural values, a threat both to his power and the kingdom of Buganda. Human rights. The Universal Declaration or customary law manifested by Kabaka Mwanga's persecution and execution of religious converts to protect traditional and cultural values. Human rights. The Universal Declaration or customary law. You decide. In 2009, David Bahati, a member of parliament in Uganda, introduced the Anti-Homosexuality Bill, supported by the American conservative evangelists, that imposes the death penalty for any form of sexual relations between persons of the same sex. The bill further imposes a 3-year sentence for anyone who won't report homosexual behavior. David Bahati and the pioneers of this bill state that homosexuality is an unnatural act that threatens the traditional family and values of Ugandan society. Human rights. The Universal Declaration or customary law manifested by David Bahati's anti-sexuality, anti-homosexuality bill, rooted in culture and religious doctrine. Female circumcision. A form of cultural and ethnic identity was a ritual practiced in some tribes as a rite of passage, preparing young girls for womanhood and marriage. It was believed by some tribes that a child would die if they came in contact with the clitoris. Others believed it inspired submissiveness, and others claimed that it enhanced fertility while reducing the woman's desire to have sex outside marriage. Female circumcision was conducted by untrained personnel under septic conditions, resulting into infection, severe pain, abscess, tumors, a spread of HIV, and even death in certain cases. Female circumcision and other ritualist practices imposed on women were first addressed by the World Health Organization in 1979 in the Sudan during the Khartoum Seminar on Traditional Practices Affecting the Health of Women and Children. They issued recommendations that governments ought to work and push towards eliminating these notorious practices. However, some of these acts are still prevalent in certain tribes and sections of the population. Human rights. The Universal Declaration or customary law imposed on women in the form of harmful ritual and traditional practices. One cannot deny that it is a tall order to come up with a standard or moral code of human rights that defines every society. In fact, cultural relativism has given rise to relevant questions about the universality of human rights. First, they argue that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was Western-made, which is true. It was a universal legal standard reached through consensus by the international community, in quotation marks. But there is no doubt that the backbone and foundation of this bill and the International Bill of Rights and the majority of other treaties signed during that period were a shadow of Western ideology. They argue that the motive of the Universal Declaration was simply to limit the role of government and its interference in the private lives of individuals and thus spread the Western doctrine of democracy. To the opponents, it is Western imperialism masked as human rights. Historically, philosophers have also chimed in on this debate of relativism versus universalism. In fact, a universal moral standard has typically been unpalatable and repudiated by most philosophers. If you are interested in philosophy, you can research on descriptive metaethical, and normative schools of thought on relativism. Sophist Protagoras, a philosopher, argued that the way things appear to me, in that way they exist for me. And the way things appear to you, in that way they exist for you. In other words, the way I see things, that is actually true for me. And when you see things differently, then that is true for you. That was Sophist Protagoras. There are some cracks in that school of thought, particularly highlighted by Plato in the argument against relativism, branded turning the tables, or something we could frankly call trying to have it both ways. Plato reiterates to Protagoras that if the way things appear to me, in that way they exist for me, and the way things appear to you, in that way they exist for you, then it would imply that relativism and that school of thought contradicts itself. In other words, it's false. Since that's not how things, or specifically relativism, appears to me, and in our case, some of the people in societies that are resisting universal human rights. So if there are people in those societies who believe in universal human rights, then if we use that theory, then that means it must be true to them. It must exist for them. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a very interesting debate. It's a very interesting debate. It is clear that these extreme positions of the theoretical and philosophical debate would yield no results if we dwell on them in the real world. But it is inevitable to also question the motive behind cultural relativism and its advocacy for customary law. Kofi Annan articulated one of the most suspicious observations, and I quote, "It was never the people who complained of the universality of human rights." He says, it was never the people who complained about the universality of human rights, nor did the people consider human rights as a Western or Northern imposition. It was often their leaders who did so. Close quotes. Customary law is often defended by oppressive regimes with the end goal of self-interest and self-preservation, rather than protecting culture and traditional values. Secondly, culture is not static. In fact, every culture has changed over time as it inevitably faces new challenges, innovation, and waves of change. Culture is also man-made, which further reaffirms the notion of conflict of interest when change is in the horizon. Culture preservation is important, but it can also be reconciled in certain areas and coexist with a universal set of values to protect vulnerable and exploited sections of society.